And that's a really common and under-discussed topic for men. And so, especially when men get together and they realize that some of the men that they hold in high regard, strong, really powerful looking men, struggle with the same sorts of self-doubt, I think it becomes like it's kind of magic.
Yeah. So what do you think it means to be a good man? What Cool. Well, then I'd love to kick it off and just know how you got interested, either maybe how you found us or you've been working on, or why the space is interesting to you.
Yeah, the space has been interesting to me, I think, for decades now. So my background's as a psychiatrist, and perhaps the professional aspect of it has been interesting for a few decades, but the personal aspect of it has been interesting for a whole lot longer because my own experience is as a man who's grown up with mental health struggles, mental health conditions, and very very frequently ran into stigma even after I sought training and started to practice within the mental health space. So there's both the element of my own personal experience, knowing how strong the stigma can be, and also my professional experience working with men in various capacities. But when I first started to work with men specifically in the space that I'm working in now, which is in professional coaching, I was working as a psychiatrist in an academic medical center, and a very small portion of my work was in the women's hospital, helping OB teams to detox and help pregnant moms withdraw from opioids and alcohol. And I noticed there was a growing space for perinatal mental health for moms, but very few services for dads. And I think I even was pretty naive to the mental health risks for men in the first year of pregnancy. And so I started to become more and more interested in early fatherhood. And that led to really thinking about the way in which mental health shows up and mental health care shows up for men. Really taken from my own experience personally, but also more recently professionally.
It's super interesting, and I think I would agree with you. One that is ignored in the early parenting stages. Also interesting the layers. I think a lot of people working in the space can relate to as like a
Yeah.
identifying with um, both a struggle and a passion for mental health, for personal experiences, and then working in the space. Um, so I would definitely love to hear how you both leverage that and draw boundaries there, because I think a lot of people tune in who work in the space as well. Um, so I'm definitely curious how you balance those as well, the personal passion and experience with actually having to be the professional voice and clarity for people you support as well.
Yeah. Well, that's a really good question. I think my boundaries have shifted over time.
Mhm.
And in a lot of ways, I I've grown up with a desire to know more about other people's experiences and stories. So with some pretty natural curiosity that has served me well, I think, in the space of being a mental health professional. But also, I think like many men, I grew up with a sort of building a wall around myself when it comes to sharing my own mental health experiences or my own vulnerabilities. Put aside just the sort of mental health stuff, sharing experiences that might have made me feel vulnerable or weak or fearful. a lot of those were closed off. So it was pretty natural for me as a mental health professional to have very strict boundaries around my own stuff. That I suppose in many ways has served me well in that domain, but in some ways, for mental health professionals, it can limit our own capacity to be human. So I think I found myself years into psychiatric practice, more than a decade in psychiatric practice before I felt comfortable sharing my own experience because I thought it was sort of superfluous. It was different from the work that I was supposed to do. And even as a mental health professional who encourages other people to show up really authentically, it almost felt like I was detracting from the experiences of people for whom I was caring. But in a lot of ways, it's not really true. Knowing that having the knowledge or expertise around mental health care doesn't immunize someone from struggling with depression or OCD or trauma-based disorders um, or eating disorders uh, is somehow connecting. And it can feel really lonesome, I think, for people who might be struggling to think that they're alone in that. And I think even the connection between people who care about mental health and who care about men's mental health, there's something really important to being able to model or showcase the way to have these authentic conversations without shaming
Hmm.
ourselves or each other.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, vulnerability is one of the themes that comes up in almost every conversation I
Hmm.
have around masculinity and mental health. And a lot of the folks we talk to self-select for being able to be vulnerable. Like I've gotten to a place where they can share with audience, which is amazing. And I think, like you said, I think sharing begets more sharing by like showing that, look, we can do this and they can be comfortable and authentic. Um, so I definitely resonate with that theme. And I have a lot of questions now.
Yeah, yeah, go for it.
I want
I
to
got a lot of time.
before I forget, I want to jump back to your work in early fatherhood, just because I think it is underdeveloped in discussion. So before we jump into other things, I wanted to make sure I hear like what are the few things you could share that you've seen or could teach people about the particular challenges there, and maybe a couple I know like general guidance or like be aware for this or this is a particular challenge you could see or this is okay kind of thing.
Sure.
Just to surface that a bit.
Yeah, well, I think that's an important one because um, it wasn't until about almost 10 years into practice that my awareness to paternal mental health conditions, particularly postpartum depression, was even really a thing. And so it strikes me as important to discuss what might impact most men in early fatherhood, but also an awareness that a substantial percent of men will experience anxiety and depression within the first year of pregnancy or within the first year postpartum and during uh, mom's pregnancy or during the pregnancy of their kid. And and so it can strike kind of out of the blue without this expectation. I think we've grown accustomed to thinking about postpartum blues or postpartum depression and how it might show up for mom and understanding other conditions that might show up for mom as well, obsessive compulsive disorder, um, bipolar illness, anxiety, psychosis that may show up in the postpartum period. We don't really talk a whole lot about depression as it impacts fathers. And we know the risk for men goes up in the first year postpartum. And it looks a little bit different than mom's experience of postpartum depression as well. It tends to peak between 3 and 6 months postpartum. It's a lot more insidious. It's slow onset. Um, it's commonly seen as a change to dad's personality because it is slowly evolving. It can also look a bit different. It can show up with attacks of anger or demands to be left alone or turning to substances or porn or gambling, essentially ways to escape. Really traditionally masculine ways in which depression might show up. So it looks a little bit different. And there are all sorts of reasons why that period is risky, including changes to hormone and neurotransmitter uh, neurotransmitters in the postpartum period. Some of the hormonal effects are actually designed to increase father-baby bonding, but also increase dad's risk for depression. So,
Mhm.
there are changes to testosterone, to estrogen, to cortisol, to oxytocin, all really evolutionarily designed to help increase bonding. Um, there are nonetheless pretty substantial changes within a man's chemistry that also contributes to the risk for depression, among other risk factors that you might think in the first year of parenting. And so it strikes me as particularly important to name that, not because most men will experience it, about 10% of men will experience a major depressive episode in the first year postpartum. So a substantial percentage. But that means about 90% of men won't, at least as far as we know. Um, but that 10% might feel very isolating. In fact, in many cases, men are likely to blame themselves or to think they've done something wrong or to diminish their own sense of value as a man if that happens. And so it becomes important to acknowledge that is a real risk.
Totally. Yeah. And I think awareness is a huge piece of this. So I thank you for surfacing your knowledge there. Really serves as just blasting a PSA. Hey, this exists and look out for it. And you're not alone if it pops up. So I'm really glad we covered that. Extending more broadly into your work in psychiatry, I'm wondering if there's a couple themes or trends that would be helpful to surface in terms of what you've seen in the combination of men seeking mental health support, either a few like major roadblocks or obstacles that can come up
Yeah.
in seeking support and treatment, and a couple ways maybe to move past those.
Yeah, for sure. Well, there are a lot of challenges associated with navigating mental health conditions as a man. And maybe the one that tends, I think, to impact men, not entirely the same way, but relatively universally, is how strongly it can impact the sense of identity as a man. A lot of the traditional masculine norms that most of us think about or most of us hold in some capacity, norms like um, maximizing strength and capability and purpose or presence or self sufficiency, a lot of those tend to get undermined in the context of depression or anxiety or trauma based conditions, really any mental health condition. And so that uh, tends to be really powerful for many men, even for men who don't necessarily think of themselves as rigidly holding on to traditional masculine ideologies or norms. It's just so common that that we hold this expectation of ourselves as being um, strong, capable, not necessarily all knowing, but um, somehow in charge or in control and strong. And when those experiences within ourselves or the ways in which we might see ourselves gets gets undermined in some way, the men tend to struggle. And in fact, men who hold really traditional masculine norms very rigidly, men who might think a man can never be weak, can never express vulnerability, can never express emotion, can never acknowledge the need for help, um, can never uh, appear to um, appear to be um, out of control. Those are the men who actually tend to suffer more when life inevitably hits a roadblock or hurdle. So when inevitably, very naturally, we violate those man laws, um, it's the men who hold on to this very rigid sense of identity as a man defined by those norms that tend to suffer um, more strongly the effects of depression and anxiety, to turn to substances, to resort to violence or self-harm. And so it's particularly important, I think, to acknowledge the interface of masculinity and mental health, because the two, in many ways, have, I think, historically been divided. There's been a sense that anything that's not women's mental health is just sort of by default men's mental health. And that's not really the case. We don't generally tend to look at mental health in the context for men of gender, but it's really important. And we do it. I think we're doing it increasingly um, for for women, but it's really important that and for folks in the LGBT community, certainly in the trans community, we need to do a better job of it. But in many ways, for men, we also need to consider how do experiences of emotion and behavior and thought show up for us through the lens of gender? Because it's more important than I think we acknowledge.
I agree, and the I think the specificity is really important. Like you said, there are connections and um, correlations between how the genders move through the world, which so it makes sense that mental health conditions and struggles would also play out differently within that context.
Yeah.
So I appreciate the uh, insight and like the work that you do, bringing that knowledge to to the guys you support is really powerful. And just love seeing that. Um,
Thanks, Henry.
in terms of, I'm kind of wondering one layer deeper how it plays out in the activation energy, like to take the first step versus once you're already doing the work, like you've kind of made the step. Okay, I want to work on this mental health condition. I want to do the work. How do you see the challenges and obstacles there? Like, what's the main barrier to the first step? And then what are the big obstacles in like making progress, doing the work once you're already in it?
Yeah. Ooh. There are a lot of barriers to making the first step. I think for many guys, for many men, seeking help has been equated with either being deficient or broken, or being weak. And that's a really powerful assumption and stigma to overcome. And so I think perhaps the way through that is to recognize the sheer importance of building something together, of having community, of being able to turn to somebody, not to be not to be corrected or necessarily put back together, fixed, but to be more fulfilled, to feel like you're optimizing your own sense of performance and purpose. It's so much stronger. We are all so much stronger when we work together. And so, unfortunately, the stigma around help seeking, particularly around mental health, has been so strong for men in this arena of being deficient or weak. So that's probably the biggest barrier. And I think the way to get through that is to normalize the discussion around seeking support. And even what that means, it's not being fixed. It's not turning to someone to undo my faults. So that's, I think, perhaps the biggest barrier to entry. Once men are in, I think, I work now predominantly in the realm of professional coaching for various reasons. I've enjoyed being able to use experience and expertise in mental health to help men to appreciate their emotion and thought patterns and behaviors currently and maybe in the past without necessarily digging too far into the past, focusing on ways forward for the future. And I think one of the things that comes up very repeatedly for men is this it is the power of inner criticism, the sheer power of the voice in our head that tends to self-doubt or self-diminish. And so when I find myself working with men and they feel like they're hitting a barrier, it's usually around thought processes that tend to diminish themselves or see the world in a way that might limit them. And it's really exciting to work with men around that particular facet because usually it's those limiting thoughts that are actually trying to protect us or those limiting beliefs that are trying to protect us in some way, but secondarily and maybe unexpectedly are limiting us. And that's a really common and under-discussed topic for men. And so, especially when men get together and they realize that some of the men that they hold in high regard, strong, really powerful looking men, struggle with the same sorts of self-doubt, I think it becomes like it's kind of magic. Like it doesn't require me to do or say anything. It almost requires seeing a reality that is very different from the ones that we create for ourselves logically, even illogically, because um, we might know that perfectionism is getting in our way, but there's a tendency also to perpetuate it even despite that knowledge. And so lots of really important and powerful things start to happen around self-doubt when we see other men who experience very similar conditions that or similar experiences. And the same could be true of not just self-doubt. The same is certainly true of any sort of sense of vulnerability. When I see another man who experiences something that I may experience, but might hide or hold in shame, there's something really powerful about that awareness.
Yeah, I'm wondering um, also if you work on guys' relationship to working career more
Yeah.
broadly. I think that self doubt and negative self-talk is another underdeveloped area when it comes to like limiting stigmas. Are there also um, trends you see with relationship to work that you helped reframe and helped have a healthier relationship with work and career?
Yeah, for sure. It's funny. Braver Man really started initially out of interest in working with fathers, but was never really intended to be strictly for early fatherhood. But very quickly in 2020, when the COVID pandemic started, our relationship, all of our relationships to work changed. And so I think what started to bubble up to the surface was some discontentment with the sort of status quo of men's career trajectories, which was you perform, maybe shoot to overperform, so you climb a ladder, so you reach the top. So in theory, once you arrive, you're feeling more fulfilled, um, more valuable. And I think um, a lot of the guys who did started to realize, well, it's not all rainbows and unicorns up here. In fact, it's quite lonely and in many ways, not the most fulfilling. And so many of the men with whom I work now are actually they may be in the process of transitioning into retirement or into a new career, but a lot of the work we end up doing is on defining a relationship to fulfillment. And that inevitably will redefine a man's relationship to his work. Setting boundaries, not to be not to underperform or be complacent or lazy in any way, but to be able to enjoy life outside of work in a way as to allow the work to be sustainable and fulfilling. And so, yeah, I think it's been a huge topic and will continue to be a huge topic for men.
Yeah, I mean, as a I resonate with that change during COVID as well. Oh, I think my earphone just died. Is it still coming through all right?
Yeah, still
That's
coming through.
good.
You sound good.
Okay, good. Yeah, I think that relationship to work had huge transformations during the pandemic, and people had their own reckoning with either work following them home, with remote work, or like you said, getting to a higher place and realizing that not all of your problems are immediately solved with the big promotion. Uh,
Yeah.
so I think it's really helpful to talk through that and share that piece where like you said, it's not about being complacent or lazy, but it's realizing that this is a piece of the puzzle. And yeah, if you can have a fulfilling career that can provide, but it's not the be all end all identity builder. Because oftentimes it's not giving the human connection or the authentic living that we all need for happiness and fulfillment and feeling like we're being genuine. So I think that balance is huge for like a holistic, healthy life.
Yeah, really. Very. Yeah. Partly that, partly that interest for me grew out of not only how I saw myself as a worker, because my work now looks extremely different from what I might have thought it would have looked like 10 or 15 years ago at the very start of um, my work in psychiatry. Oh, 20 years ago, at the very start of my work in psychiatry. I was very much moving along the trajectory, the sort of expected path hitting the hurdles or hitting the mile markers and climbing in a way that sort of made sense if you look at it on paper. And I made the decision to disrupt that, which was a bit of a challenge, quite a bit of a challenge, because in that process, I knew that I was doing something important for myself and my mission, really my mission to help men. But also I lost a lot of a sense of identity. I was doing it in a place where I had to forge a path. It really wasn't a predetermined one. And I was so accustomed to just walking along the path that was already made and running along. I mean, I think I was racing and not really stopping along the way to think, well, um, how am I experiencing fulfillment here or there? It wasn't really until I made the decision to slow down and recalibrate that, and I was fortunate that I could, um, that I was able to move toward a, a different part of my own sense of identity as a professional. And that's been challenging because it's not been very easy, but it's also been very rewarding. And so certainly worthwhile, but you don't get the usual, like, you don't get the same attaboys or awareness that you're making the right next move, at least from the eyes of people around you.
Mm-hmm.
It's really it's a different experience, and one that I'm glad to have. I've never thought of myself in any way as sort of veering outside of the academic realm, veering outside of my work as an academic physician. And
Mm-hmm.
so entering into the space where I connect with, where I work one-on-one with men in groups and cohorts, but also connect with other people like you who are doing important work around building advocacy and awareness. Um, that's, for many of us, pretty uncharted. I mean, what you're doing is kind of uncharted territory, which is really great. And also sometimes makes you think, well, am I doing it right? Am I moving in the right direction? Am I going fast enough? And for many guys, that's a real and very important part of our identities. And I saw that
Totally.
a lot, especially in my work as a psychiatrist in palliative medicine, where I was seeing men seeing people of all backgrounds and genders in the end of life. But the end of life for men, and maybe this is a different conversation that we have altogether, is a very different time of looking back on what was important and maybe what was less so. And it struck me then that a lot of what was less important was also a lot of the stuff that we give a tremendous amount of mental energy and attention to in our formative and sort of most productive years of life.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I would love a follow-on conversation on
Yeah,
this topic.
likewise.
It's another totally well undeveloped across the board. I think um, I think the U.S. has a pretty unhealthy relationship with aging and death, and is
Very.
not talked about. And I think even more so for guys. I would love to hear what you've seen and looking back, or for guys looking back and kind of reflecting on their lives. It would be such interesting insight. So I do have another meeting coming up, but I would
Yeah.
absolutely love a follow-on conversation about that.
Henry, let's do it.
So that would be really wonderful. And I'll be in my, hopefully we can find a time where I'm in my actual recording space.
No, you're good. You're good. This was great. Thank you.
Yeah. So what do you think it means to be a good man? What